The first thing Gideon Marsh noticed about Sable Creek was that nobody would look him in the eye when he asked directions to the Whitlock ranch. The second thing he noticed was that they all knew exactly where it was. "Take the north road past the church," the stable boy finally muttered, not raising his gaze from the bridle he was mending. "But mister, if you're thinking of courting, don't. That woman buries husbands the way most folks bury dogs." New Mexico Territory, 1886. The kind of country that didn't forgive mistakes, and a town that didn't forget them either. Gideon had ridden 400 miles to look at horses. He was not a man who scared easy, and he had learned long ago that a town's gossip usually said more about the town than about the person it was gossiping over. Still, the warning followed him the whole way up that north road, repeating itself in his head like a hoofbeat he couldn't outrun. 3 husbands. Buried 3 husbands. He would learn her name before he learned anything else about her. Naomi Whitlock, 34 years old, the finest horse breeder between Santa Fe and the Arizona line, and, according to every soul in Sable Creek, cursed. The ranch sat in a shallow valley ringed by red mesas, green in a country that was mostly the color of rust and bone. Gideon saw the horses before he saw the house. 24 head of good stock grazing behind split-rail fence, coats gleaming with the kind of care that spoke of a woman who did not waste anything, least of all attention. She was standing in the corral when he rode up, a bay yearling circling her on a long lead, and she didn't stop working the horse to greet him. She had dark hair pulled back beneath a wide hat, sleeves rolled to the elbow, and eyes the pale gray-green of sagebrush after rain. There was no softness in the way she held herself. There was, instead, the particular stillness of someone who had learned to expect trouble and had decided, a long time ago, to meet it standing up. "You're here about the horses," she said, not a question. "I am. Name's Gideon Marsh. I know who you are." "Word travels faster than you rode." She finally looked at him, and something flickered behind her eyes. Appraisal, maybe, or weariness at having to do this dance again. "Did they tell you about me before they told you the price of a horse?" "They told me you buried 3 husbands." She didn't flinch. "4, if you count the man who ran this ranch before he married me. I only married 3 of them." She looped the lead rope over the rail with practiced economy. Daniel Whitlock, thrown from a green horse he had no business breaking alone. Amos Reyes, caught in a rock slide up at the Silver Vein claim. Silas Pruitt, her jaw tightened just slightly. Fever, or so the doctor called it, though it came on him faster than any fever I ever nursed. She met his eyes squarely. 8 years, 3 men. "Most folks in this town think I'm marked, Mr. Marsh. Some think worse. I'd rather you hear it plain from me than crooked from them." Gideon dismounted slowly, giving himself time to choose his words. "Sounds to me like you've had more bad luck than any one woman ought to carry." "Luck." She said the word like it tasted bitter. "That's one name for it. You don't believe it's luck." For the first time, something like surprise crossed her face. The surprise of a person unused to being asked a real question instead of being handed someone else's conclusion. "I buried 3 good men in 8 years, Mr. Marsh, and not one of their deaths made a lick of sense once I stopped grieving long enough to look at it straight. But I've learned there's no profit in saying that out loud in Sable Creek. They already think I'm cursed. They'd think me mad on top of it." "I didn't come here to think anything of you," Gideon said. "I came to look at horses." "Then look," she said, and something in her voice, not quite relief, not quite gratitude, but close kin to both, told him she had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly that. He stayed 3 days longer than the horse business required, and told himself each morning it was because the deal wasn't finished. On the second evening, she fed him at her table without being asked twice, and he watched the careful, deliberate way she moved through her own kitchen, like a woman keeping count of every door, every window, every shadow that crossed the yard. "You watch the windows," he said, "like you're waiting on something." She set down a plate harder than she meant to. "I've learned to. After the third one, after the second." She sat across from him, and in the lamplight he could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been put there by sun alone. Daniel's death, I could believe. Green horses kill careless men, and Daniel was careless, God rest him. Amos was careful. Amos didn't take chances with rock or timber. He'd worked mines since he was a boy in Sonora, knew every groan a mountain makes before it lets go. The men who found him said the slide came down clean, no warning at all. That's not how mountains behave, Mr. Marsh, not for a man who knew them the way Amos did. And Silas? Her hands went still around her cup. Silas Pruitt never had a sick day I knew of. Then 1 week he was hale, and the next he was burning up with a fever that had no rash, no cough, nothing the doctor could name, and dead within 4 days. I sat up with him every one of those nights. I know fever, Mr. Marsh. I nursed my own mother through typhoid when I was a girl. What took Silas wasn't any fever I ever saw. Gideon set down his fork. "You think somebody's killing your husbands?" "I think," she said carefully, as though she had rehearsed not saying this exact thing for a very long time, "that a woman who says such things about respectable deaths in a respectable town gets called crazy, or worse, gets called dangerous. So I stopped saying it. I buried them. I wore my black, and I let Sable Creek believe I was cursed, because cursed is a story people can live with. Murdered is a story somebody has to answer for." She looked up at him, and for the first time he saw not grief in her face, but something harder, a slow-burning, carefully banked anger. "Nobody in this town wants to answer for anything, Mr. Marsh. Least of all the men who'd profit most if I stopped having a husband to stand beside me. Who profits?" She hesitated, the first true hesitation he'd seen in her since he arrived. "That's the trouble. I don't rightly know. But this ranch sits on the best water in 40 miles, and there's men in Sable Creek who've wanted that water since before Daniel and I ever said our vows." She shook her head, as if shaking off the thought entirely. "You should finish your business and ride on, Mr. Marsh. I mean that kindly. Whatever's circling this house, I won't have it land on a stranger who only came to buy a horse. Maybe I'm not just here for the horse anymore." The words surprised him as much as they surprised her. She looked at him a long moment, weighing him the way she might weigh a green colt, for soundness, for temperament, for the 1,000 small tells that separated a good animal from a dangerous one. "Then you're a fool," she said quietly, "but I've been lonely enough these 2 years to be glad of one." He didn't leave. He told himself it was the horses. There was, after all, real business to finish, papers to draw, a string of young stock worth the trip. But every evening found him back at her table, and every evening the conversation ran a little deeper, until the ranch hands had stopped asking when the buyer from Texas was heading home, and had started, instead, watching him the way men watch someone they are quietly hoping will stay. Naomi did not make it easy. She had built, over 8 years and 3 funerals, a wall so practiced that even her own affection seemed to alarm her. But Gideon was patient in the way that good horsemen are patient, never pushing, never crowding, only staying steady until the animal decided, on its own terms, that his hand was safe. It was Naomi's foreman, a weathered Kiowa Comanche man named Robert Long Walker, who finally spoke plainly to him one morning while they mended fence along the north pasture. "You mean to court her?" Long Walker said. It was not a question, any more than Naomi's had been. "Might be. Then you ought to know what you're courting into." Long Walker set his fence pliers down and looked out toward the mesas, his voice low. "I've worked this land 11 years, since before Daniel Whitlock ever married her. I watched all 3 of those men die, Mr. Marsh, and I'll tell you what I never told the sheriff, because the sheriff's cousin owns the assay office in town, and I didn't trust where my words might travel." He turned. "Every one of those men died within a season of Miss Naomi refusing to sell water rights to Cyrus Whitlock." Gideon went still. "Whitlock, her first husband's kin, Daniel's older brother, owns the bank in Sable Creek now, and half the paper on every ranch within 2 days' ride. Every ranch except this one. Daniel's father left this land to Daniel outright, cut Cyrus out entire, on account of some old quarrel neither brother ever spoke of. When Daniel died, the land passed to Naomi as his widow, clean and legal, and Cyrus has been trying to get it back into Whitlock hands ever since, by purchase, by pressure, and when those failed, Long Walker didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. You think he's killing her husbands to force her to sell? I think a woman alone, grieving and afraid, is easier to buy out than a woman with a husband standing at her shoulder, telling the bank no. Long Walker picked his pliers back up, the conversation closing as abruptly as it had opened. I've got no proof, Mr. Marsh. Cyrus Whitlock is careful, and he is patient, and he has never once dirtied his own hands that anyone has seen. But I've buried 3 good men on this land, and I mean to see the 4th one live to be old, or I mean to see nobody else ever stand in that spot at all. Do you understand me? I understand you. Then watch your back, and watch hers twice as hard. That night, Gideon told Naomi what Long Walker had said, watching her face carefully as he did. She did not look surprised. She looked, instead, like a woman finally hearing someone else say aloud the thing she had spent 2 years too afraid to say to herself. Cyrus came to the funeral, she said quietly. Every one of them stood at the graveside with his hat in his hands and told me how sorry he was for my loss. And not 2 weeks later, his man from the bank was at my door, with papers for the water rights, kind as you please, telling me a widow alone couldn't be expected to manage such a burden. She laughed, short and without humor. I told him what he could do with his papers, all 3 times, and each time a husband died first. Each time. She wrapped her arms around herself, though the room was warm. I told myself it was coincidence. Grief makes you doubt your own eyes, Mr. Marsh, makes you afraid that if you say the ugly thing out loud, you'll only prove yourself as mad as the town already thinks you are. But I always knew. Some part of me has known since Amos. Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the name. I loved that man. I loved all 3 of them, in their own way, and I have spent 2 years being called cursed by a town that never once asked whether the curse had a name and a bank account. Then we give it one, Gideon said. A name folks can't ignore. You don't know what you're offering to do. I know exactly what I'm offering. He reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, giving her the choice. You warned me plain the first day I rode up here. You said you'd buried 3 husbands, like you expected that to send me back down the road, same as it sent off every other man fool enough to look at you twice. It should have. Maybe. But I've buried people too, Mrs. Whitlock, a wife, back in Texas. Fever same as poor Silas, near as I can tell from what you've described. And I know what it is to watch someone you love slip away from something that made no earthly sense. I'm not scared of your ghosts. I'm not scared of your curse, because I don't believe in curses. I believe in men greedy enough to make their own luck at somebody else's expense. And I mean to prove it, whether you'll have me or not. He finally let his hand close over hers. But I'd rather do it standing beside you than circling around you like every other fool in this town. Naomi looked at their joined hands for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped to something raw and unguarded. 3 men have died for loving this land, Gideon. I won't watch a 4th. Then I'll be the one who stays, he said simply, not the one who dies. The one who stays and finds out who's been doing the killing before he gets the chance to try again. They did not announce a courtship. They could not afford to, not with a man like Cyrus Whitlock watching the ranch, as Long Walker was certain he did, through eyes that were not always his own. Instead, Gideon stayed on as a hired hand, breaking the young stock, mending fence, making himself as unremarkable as a man his size and bearing could manage. He and Naomi kept their growing understanding quiet, traded in glances across the corral, and conversations held low after the other hands had turned in. But quiet did not mean safe. It was 3 weeks into his stay that the first attempt came, not against Naomi, but against him. He had ridden out alone to check the fence line along the northern boundary, the same stretch where the silver vein claim climbed up into loose red rock. He never saw the shot coming. He heard it, a flat crack that sent his horse rearing, and felt the burn across his upper arm a half-second later, hot as a brand. He was off the horse and behind a boulder before the second shot came, close enough that rock chips stung his cheek. He lay pinned for the better part of an hour, blood soaking his sleeve, watching the tree line for any hint of movement, before whoever had fired at last gave up and he heard hoofbeats retreating north, toward the mining claim, toward land that, Long Walker had told him, belonged to the Whitlock Mining Company. He rode back to the ranch, grey-faced and bleeding, and Naomi's reaction told him everything about what those 3 graves had cost her. She did not scream. She did not weep. She went white as bone, and her hands, when she cut away his shirt sleeve to see the wound, did not shake, because, he understood in that moment, she had done this before. 3 times before, she had learned, in the worst way a woman can learn anything, exactly how to tend a wound and keep her composure while some private part of her screamed. "It's shallow," she said, voice flat with the effort of holding steady. "You'll keep the arm, you'll keep your life, if I have anything to say about it." She looked up at him, and the fear in her eyes was not for herself. This is what happened to Amos. Not exactly, but this is how it starts. An accident nobody can quite explain. And then another, closer, and then nothing, Gideon said through gritted teeth as she packed the wound. "Because I saw where that rider went, Naomi, north, toward the silver vein, and I mean to find out exactly who was riding that horse." It took 2 more weeks of careful, quiet work, Long Walker asking questions among the miners who owed him old favors, Gideon riding into Sable Creek under the pretense of horse business and listening more than he spoke, Naomi going through 8 years of correspondence she had never had the stomach to burn, before the pieces began to fit. The rifle that had grazed Gideon's arm belonged, by every account Long Walker could gather, to a man named Ezra Coates, a mine foreman who answered to nobody in Sable Creek but Cyrus Whitlock himself. Coates had been on the silver vein claim the day Amos Reyes died, in a slide that experienced miners still swore should never have happened on that face of rock. Coates had also, according to the assay office clerk who owed Long Walker a debt of his own, been paid a curious and unrecorded sum from the bank's private account in the week after Silas Pruitt's sudden fever, a fever, Naomi now remembered with sick clarity, that had begun the same evening Cyrus Whitlock had come calling with a bottle of good whiskey and a fresh set of papers for the water rights, and had stayed long enough to share a glass with her husband while she was out at the barn. "He poisoned that whiskey," Naomi said, the words coming out of her like something long buried, finally breaking the surface. "I poured Silas a glass myself that night, from the same bottle Cyrus brought. I never thought. Why would I think? Because he's careful," Gideon said grimly. Careful enough to make 3 deaths look like 3 different kinds of bad luck, spread out over 8 years, so no one death looked at alone would ever raise a question. It's only when you stand back and look at all 3 together that the pattern shows itself. He looked at her, He's not going to stop, Naomi. Not now that I'm here asking questions and not riding off like the others did. Then we don't wait for him to come to us, Naomi said, and there was something in her voice that had not been there the day Gideon rode up to her corral. Not the careful stillness of a woman braced for another loss, but the hard, clean edge of a woman who had finally stopped being afraid and started being angry instead. I've spent 8 years letting this town believe I was cursed because the truth was too dangerous to speak. I'm done being quiet, Gideon. If Cyrus Whitlock wants this land, he can answer for what he's done to get it, in front of God and the whole of Sable Creek. They laid the trap on a Sunday, when the church bell had emptied half the town into the square, and Cyrus Whitlock, as he did every week, stood on the bank steps in his fine grey coat, greeting his neighbors with the easy warmth of a man who had never once been questioned in his life. Naomi walked up those steps in her best black dress, the one she had worn to 3 funerals, and the crowd went quiet, the way a crowd does when it senses a story about to happen. "Cyrus," she said, loud enough to carry, "I want to talk to you about Silas's whiskey." Something flickered behind the banker's composed face, small, quick, gone, almost before it showed. "Naomi, this isn't the place. It's exactly the place." She turned to face the gathering crowd, and Gideon watched her draw herself up, the way he'd seen her do the very first day, in the corral, meeting trouble on her feet, instead of running from it. 3 husbands I've buried in this town, and every one of you has called me cursed behind my back for 2 years. Well, I'm done wearing your curse, because it was never mine to wear. She held up a small brown bottle, the same shape, Gideon knew, as the one Longwalker had recovered, unopened and forgotten, from the back of Naomi's pantry, where it had sat since the night Silas died. This bottle came from Cyrus Whitlock's own cellar. There's enough of the original whiskey left in it for any doctor in this territory to test, and I intend to have it tested, in Santa Fe, by a man Cyrus Whitlock has no bank to buy. The color drained from the banker's face. "Naomi, you're grieving. You're not thinking clearly." "I am thinking more clearly than I have in 8 years." Her voice did not shake. "Amos Reyes knew that mountain better than any man alive, and it killed him the 1 week you were pressing me hardest for the water rights. Daniel died breaking a horse he had no cause to break, alone, the same season you first came asking to buy him out. And Silas," her voice caught, just once, before she steadied it. "Silas drank whiskey from your bottle and was dead within 4 days of a fever no doctor could name. I loved every one of those men, Cyrus. I buried every one of them believing it was bad luck, because the alternative was too monstrous to say out loud. But bad luck doesn't have a foreman on your payroll shooting at strangers on my north fence line. Bad luck doesn't pay unrecorded sums out of a bank's private account the same week a man falls sick." A murmur ran through the crowd, and Gideon saw Sheriff Coy Harmon, a man who had never once, in 2 years, thought to question 3 convenient deaths in his own town, step forward with a new and uneasy interest on his face. "These are wild accusations," Cyrus said, but his voice had lost its steadiness. "I've done nothing but try to help a grieving widow. You've done nothing but try to steal my water and my land. And when 3 husbands stood between you and that ranch, 3 husbands died." Naomi's eyes never left his. "I have a witness who watched your foreman put a rifle to a stranger's back on my property 3 weeks ago. I have a bottle with your whiskey in it that any doctor can test for poison, and I have 8 years of letters where you asked and asked and asked to buy water rights that were never for sale, right up until the week before each of my husbands died." She turned to the sheriff. "I'd like you to do your job, Sheriff Harmon. I should have asked you to do it 8 years ago, and I am ashamed that I let fear and grief and this town's gossip keep me quiet for so long. I'm not quiet anymore." It was Ezra Coates, cornered 2 days later at the Silver Vein claim with the sheriff's men closing in from both sides of the canyon, who finally broke and told the truth entire. The rock slide he had triggered deliberately with a charge of blasting powder timed to Amos Reyes's shift. The horse he had spooked with a hidden burr under the saddle blanket that had thrown Daniel Whitlock to his death. The vial of arsenic Cyrus had purchased from a Santa Fe chemist under a false name and slipped into Silas Pruitt's whiskey with his own hand, while Naomi tended the horses in the barn. Coates gave it all up in exchange for a lighter sentence, and Cyrus Whitlock, who had built a career on being the most respectable man in Sable Creek, was led out of his own bank in irons, while half the town that had once called Naomi cursed now stood in stunned and shamefaced silence. They buried the truth of it properly, the way 3 good men had deserved to be buried with all along, not with whispers of curses, but with the plain, hard facts of what had actually been done to them. Naomi stood at each grave one final time, this time not as a widow marked by bad luck, but as a woman who had finally been allowed to grieve without the added weight of a town's suspicion. Gideon stood beside her at every one. "You don't have to stay for this part," she told him quietly, at Silas's grave, the last of the 3. "You've done what you came to do. Cyrus is in irons. The truth is out. The ranch is safe. Nobody would think less of you for riding on, now that the danger's past." "I told you the first night I stayed for supper," Gideon said. "I'm not the one who dies, Naomi. I'm the one who stays." He took her hand, there among the graves of 3 men who had loved her and lost everything for it, and did not let go. "I mean to keep saying it until you believe it's true." She looked at him for a long moment, the New Mexico wind moving red dust across the mesas behind him, and for the first time since Gideon Marsh had ridden up her north road, asking after horses, Naomi Whitlock let herself smile, without any grief riding behind it. "3 husbands," she said softly. "I warned you plain." "You did," Gideon agreed, "and I told you plain right back." They were married the following spring, in the same small church where 3 funerals had once emptied out into a town's cruel whispering, and this time the whole of Sable Creek turned out not to gossip, but to stand witness to a woman who had refused, at last, to carry a curse that was never hers, and to a man who had ridden 400 miles for horses and found, instead, the one thing worth staying for. The water stayed hers, and on quiet evenings when the mesas turned the color of embers and the horses settled for the night, Gideon Marsh would sit on the porch beside his wife and think that some men rode away from danger their whole lives without ever once finding anything worth riding toward, while he, warned plainly at a corral gate by a woman who expected him to run, had found, in staying, everything he had never known to look for.